Hi, my name is Megan Gaston, and this is my case study for AEP855 Educational Leadership. It is titled When Ethics and Policies Collide. So to get started, jump in and summarize the case, establishing the facts. What's happening here is we have a first-year assistant principal named Mr. Inman who is working at a junior high school. And he has spent much of his year working hard to build a relationship with one of the most difficult students on his caseload, James. And this student is from the south side of town, which is described as a rougher part of town. The relationship was currently paying off. Mr. Inman hadn't had James in his office for quite some time. James and his devoted followers had improved their grades. They were beginning to mingle with others. And James himself had not been involved in a fight for months, which was a record for him. However, despite the positives being seen, James has had 3 tardies in this current week of school. And per policy, Mr. Inman is to follow up with him about it. And so Mr. Inman calls James to his office for a conversation. So James was in 5th period when this happened, and the teacher stepped out into the hallway to monitor James as he was walking towards the office. And when she did this, she noticed that James had stopped to talk to another student named David, and it appeared that they made an exchange of some kind. The teacher believed, based off of James's history and reputation, that drugs might have been exchanged. She did notice that the other boy, David, seemed quite nervous. David was an honor student, a musician, and he was a student that had no previous discipline violations on his record. But the teacher went ahead and called Mr. Inman to let him know about the exchange and that David had seemed nervous. And so with James already on his way to the office, Mr. Inman asked the school resource officer if he would go down and get David out of class and escort him to his office as well. Getting both boys into the office, Mr. Inman also invites the school resource officer to be a part of the conversation. So they begin to discuss the situation, the exchange in the hallway. James said that he had just given David something to hold for him. No big deal. When the resource officer questioned David of what the item was, David didn't want to say anything. He got quite nervous. He was shaking. He did get some tears in his eyes. And so based off of the lack of information, the school resource officer made the decision to search David. And when he did so, he discovered a pair of brass knuckles. Now, these happen to be a prohibited weapon that breaks school policy, but it also breaks the law because it is a possession of a weapon, which is a felony offense. And so the police officer, school resource officer, immediately handcuffs David. So when this happens, James quickly pipes up and makes the omission, a direct quote, "Hey, I told him I would kick his ass if he didn't hold the knucks for me. Those are mine. I was going to use them after school to take care of some personal business." So immediately in the situation, Mr. Inman is quite proud of James because he can see the progress that James has made recently by simply admitting that he is the rightful owner of the item, and just taking responsibility for the situation is a big deal that James has done that. And so Mr. Inman is feeling full of pride, but then that quickly diminishes when he realizes that James is also being handcuffed and David is not being released. So Mr. Inman asks the officer if he would please release David, but then he was informed by the officer that no, because both boys had possession of the weapon on school property, they would both be charged with the felony possession. Now, according to the school district's zero tolerance policy, in addition to the legal charges that the boys are facing from the school resource officer, they're also subject to the zero tolerance board policy, which makes it very clear that both boys are to be expelled for no less than 45 days, and they would be sent to the district's disciplinary alternative education program, the DAEP. And so, per policy, Mr. Inman begins to fill out the expulsion paperwork for the boys. He starts with James. James is no stranger to the district DAEP program. He's been there before. So Mr. Inman is feeling pretty confident about filling out that paperwork. He also calls James's mother, and she is not surprised either. In fact, she says that she is fine with leaving James at the detention facility for a short amount of time to let him think about his decisions and suffer the consequences, and hopefully it will teach him a lesson. But when it came to filling out David's paperwork, it was Mr. Inman was feeling quite different about that situation. Called David's mother. David's mother was very upset. She couldn't believe that David was still being charged, even though the other student clearly admitted that he forced David to do it. And so, in an ethical dilemma here, Mr. Inman, reflecting on David's perfect disciplinary record, the fact that he knows that James is a known intimidator, James admitted to forcing David to do it. He just decides that he would do what is best and fair for David, regardless of the policy, and he tears up the expulsion paperwork that is for David. It is a violation of policy, but sending David into a hellhole like the district's DAEP program would be a mistake, and one that would shatter David's future, his dreams, and his potential. So the next week, David returns to school. He's back in class. Mr. Inman is feeling pretty confident about the decision that he made, and then he gets contacted by the director of secondary education. And this person directs Mr. Inman to follow through with the expulsion paperwork on David. And if he doesn't, he's threatened to have an official reprimand put in his personnel file. So now he has an ethical dilemma to deal with. He needs to either follow through with policy and expel David into the district program, or risk having that reprimand in his file. I would imagine that this is pretty difficult for the principal, for Mr. Inman, because this is his first year working in the district, and I'm sure, he's wanting to do a really good job. He's wanting to please his superiors, but at the same time, he has his ethical, moral compass that he wants to adhere to, and so he's just really stuck in a dilemma here. Some legal issues that are present in this case study. The student was searched by the school officer. David was verbally threatened by James. There was a felony possession of a prohibited weapon on school property. And there's also a school district zero tolerance board policy, which demands the students be expelled per the behavior that they showed. Some ethical issues. I already mentioned Mr. Inman is really conflicted on what to do with David's consequences. He knows that David was an innocent party, although David did make the decision to hold the brass knuckles for James. He did it because he was threatened and intimidated. So although he is guilty, he's also, he was bullied into it. So an ethical issue is that deciding not to file the expulsion paperwork for David is a direct violation of the district policy. And then we also have an ethical dilemma here with the superior, being the director of secondary education, threatening to file the official reprimand on the assistant principal for not following through. So to synthesize the events in a single sentence, Mr. Inman, a first-year junior high assistant principal, must make a decision between ethics or policy on how to handle a seemingly innocent student wrapped up in a situation with another student known for intimidation of weaker students, when his decision could result in a consequence for himself. So to break down the place and program, the place is an urban city. We don't have a city name or a location, but we do know that it is large enough to have a south side of town, which is where James is from. It also happens to be that Mr. Inman grew up in the south side of this town, which is why he was drawn to mentor James in the first place. The school is Rocket Junior High School, Junior High School, and with grades 7 through 9. There are approximately 900 students. We know that it has an honors program within the school because David is part of that program. It also has some type of a band or musical department because David is an avid music player. The district has its own disciplinary alternative education program as well. The people involved in this case, we have the assistant principal, Mr. Richard Inman. It is his first year serving in this role. We have 2 students, James, who is a muscular, heavily tattooed student. He was the undisputed leader of his group, and he was known to use intimidation tactics. And then we have David, who was a slightly built young scholar with no previous discipline violations. We have the 5th period teacher who contacted Mr. Inman after witnessing the exchange between James and David. We have the school resource officer. We have James and David's mothers who were contacted about the situation. And we also have the director of secondary education, who is the one that contacts Mr. Inman about following through with the expulsion paperwork on David. All right, sorry about that. Some unknowns that we have here. We don't know the size of the city. We don't know the demographics. We also don't know, I know the school has a resource officer, but I'm not sure the full extent of why they have their own resource officer. I'm not sure if they have a lot of common problems, discipline problems. And then also we don't know about the principal. We don't hear anything about the principal. So I'm just kind of curious if the principal supports Mr. Inman in his decision to not follow through with the expulsion paperwork on David. Okay, so to review and prioritize the information, Mr. Inman asked the school officer to be present during the meeting, but Mr. Inman led the questioning. When the situation unfolded, the school officer followed legal protocol. And even when James admitted his guilt and David's innocence, the officer still took both students to jail and charged them with felony possession. Mr. Inman felt that David should not be subjected to such harsh punishment because he knew that he was innocent and he had been coerced into doing what James had requested that he do. So then Mr. Inman decides to break policy and not follow not file the expulsion paperwork for David, although he does follow that he does file the paperwork for James. Some stakeholders in this case study, Mr. Inman, he has his reputation at stake and possibly his job. He is a first-year assistant principal, and so he wants to do what's right to be able to keep his job. David, his future's at stake. He's never been in trouble before, and now he has an official legal charge that's going to be brought before the court systems, and then with this possible 45-day expulsion that goes on his record that could affect his ability to get into college. We have the school board. They have a policy which has a huge stake in this case study. The director of secondary education, I am assuming that this position has something to do with following up on that district program. And so contacting to make sure that the principals, assistant principals are following policy and doing their job. The principal has a stake in this case study, although he's not directly involved in the case as we have it. He is above Mr. Inman in the school, and so therefore he is ultimately responsible for the decisions and actions of Mr. Inman, and so therefore he also plays a huge role in this as far as deciding how to move forward. All relevant stakeholders at this point have not been consulted. We haven't heard anything about the principal or the superintendent's opinion, or even if the school board has thoughts on this particular case. Do I know enough? I wish that I knew if this type of situation is something that happens frequently, if they're trying to set a precedence with this situation. So something like that would be really helpful to know. I'd also like to know more about the principal's position in the situation, and why the director of secondary education is so interested in the follow-through of Mr. Inman, if he is directly tied into the program somehow, and why they're not allowing the administration at this particular school to handle their own situations. Are administrator decisions generally supported at the district level? But even with these unknowns, I do feel like I know enough to make an ethical decision plan. So I have decided on 4 possible options. Option 1 is to take no action. I do nothing and see what happens. So I leave it as is. Option 2 is I resign. I resign from my position immediately. In my letter to the school board, I explain how their policy conflicts with my personal ethical code. Option 3 is I relent to the pressure by the director of the secondary education, and I file the expulsion paperwork on David, sending him to the district's disciplinary alternative education program. Even though I don't truly believe this, I want to keep my job, and I want to save face, and I want the upper administration to be happy with me, and so I put myself above my feelings and ethical code towards David. And then option 4, commitment to ethics. I meet with my principal to discuss the situation and where I stand on the issue. I maintain my position on the situation, accept the consequence of having the official reprimand in my personal file. I send a follow-up email to the director of secondary education and the superintendent. I petition to speak at the next board meeting and request a review of the zero tolerance policy. So evaluating my options, some pros and cons. So option 1 of doing nothing, the pros to this is that it's easy, and that I modeled ethical behavior. I did what I thought was right with David. I protected innocent students' current and future success. My pro is that I might not get written up. The director might have just been calling my bluff to see what I would do, and so maybe I don't get written up. The cons is that I am breaking a set board policy that within my position I have agreed to uphold. I might get written up, and I also may become a target for termination in the future for not following policy. Option 2, resigning. By doing so, I uphold my own moral compass. I've modeled ethical behavior, and I took a stand for something I believed in. The cons to this is obviously I don't have a job anymore. It does not allow me to advocate for change, and it could also be damaging to my reputation and my ability to obtain a future position. Option 3, relent. The pros to this is that I would be following the district policy that I have agreed to uphold, and this would make the director happy. However, there's several cons to this. In the case study, Mr. Inman really talks about how that district program is described as a hellhole, and I would be sending an innocent student into that program, and I would have to live with that decision, possibly damaging that student's future and going against my own ethical code. And then option 4, commitment to ethics. The pros of this is that I've modeled ethical behavior. I've protected an innocent student's current and future success. I've shown the capacity to evaluate, communicate about, and advocate for ethical and legal decisions, and I could potentially have the policy changed. The cons to this is that I very well may receive an official reprimand, and I may become a target for termination. So the best option in my mind is option 4, commitment to ethics. Leaders must evaluate the ethical dimensions of issues and analyze decisions in terms of established ethical frameworks before making any type of a decision. Zero tolerance policies have been proven to be ineffective when handling discipline issues. There's not a one-size-fits-all consequence to every possible behavior, dilemma, or situation. So blanket consequences without considering circumstances is just disastrous. At the end of the day, we're here for the students, and expelling David and potentially damaging his future is not warranted. I am in the position to advocate for policy change, and therefore I would want to do that. So to implement this decision, first, I would request to meet with my direct superior, who is the principal, so that he or she is informed of what happened. I'm so sorry. I would also explain how I handled it and how I plan to continue handling the situation. Then I would write an email to the director of secondary education. I'm sorry, I've been sick. Accepting my consequence and notifying them that I intend to advocate for change with the school board policy. I would petition to speak at the next board meeting and request to review the zero tolerance policy. For the board meeting, I would create a presentation to explain the research behind zero tolerance policies and how they can negatively impact our students. Following the presentation, I would ask that the board reconsider current policy, allowing a team to be formed to create and propose a more effective policy in the near future. My plan B, if this did not work, would be to finish out the year strong, upholding my ethical code and supporting students. But I would also begin looking for a new position within a district that more closely aligned with my values. And these are my references. Thank you.